Good afternoon. My name is Bei Lu. I'm a professor at Tsinghua University and also editor-in-chief, one of the editor-in-chiefs of the WeChat social media called the Intellectuals. So this whole session is jointly developed by the World Economic Forum and the Intellectuals. So I need to say a few words about the Intellectuals. The Intellectuals is something that perhaps you don't have in the West. It's a WeChat-based social media. And in this WeChat-based social media, this is something very unique and very, very powerful. That is, it's a, anyone can now run a public WeChat. Basically, it's a medium. It's also a social, it's a social medium. And a few years ago, 2015, Professor Xie Yu of Princeton University, who's a sociologist, and Professor Yi Rao of Peking University, who's a neurobiologist, and myself, we started this WeChat group. Now it's becoming one of the most influential social, science social media in China. And what we do is we write articles, we publish articles every day. We host events. We also host debate and live broadcasting and all kinds of internet-based activities. Our mission is to communicate science, promote reforms, and also tries to raise awareness of science and changing culture of science, culture in China. All right, so now let me introduce our distinguished panel. From my left-hand side, Professor Wang Yifang of Institute of High Energy Physics in Chinese Academy of Science, Professor Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, who is the president of European Research Council, and also Professor Mei Li, who's the dean of, I don't know if it's called a School of Economy or School of Entrepreneurship in the Science ShanghaiTech University, and also Professor Wang Liming, who is a professor of Zhejiang University. He's also our rising young scientist who represent the young scientists to attend this forum. And the theme of today's session is, in short, how will China rise as a global science leader shaping the future of science? Now, this is a topic that it's in many people's mind, and it's very fitting for today's, for this World Economic Forum, in that it's happening in Dalian, and it's, China is growing as a second largest economy, and it's expected to be a leader. Now, I think many of us in our mind says we're not quite there yet, or China is not quite there yet, but what we'd like to discuss today are I would like to discuss the topic into two parts, two aspects, if you will. First is what it takes or what it makes a science leader. By definition, what is a science leader? Second is how do we get there? How a country, a nation, will become a world leader in science. So let's begin with the first part, and I'm sure all our panelists all have their own opinions and own perspective. So let me ask, Professor Jean-Pierre, you can start first. Is science leader is because people expect China to be a science leader, and then science leader is because there's huge investment in science? Is it because there's a lot of output, say number of patents and number of papers, or there are more people, the largest number of people involved in science? Is it these enough to become? Oh, first, I forgot. There's one thing that I want, a fun game I would like to take. I want to take a vote from the audience whether you want this thing to be in Chinese or in English. If you want this to be in English, raise your hands. So that, I mean, we had followed the majority vote, right? I mean, so that says China is not quite there yet. We cannot run this in Chinese. All right, so Jean-Pierre, maybe you want to take on from that. I mean, and then the rule of this is that everyone should speak no longer than 3 minutes, but anyone can jump in if you have something to say. And I would like to actually see some debates on certain topics.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Well, first, the first comment I want to make is that China is a country which has a long tradition of science. And for sure, it has transformed itself in recent years in a great way. Of course, I think we should never forget that really science enterprise is really some kind of an ecosystem which has many components. The key element, of course, are the people. And of course, then people have to find the right conditions for them to develop properly their science. This cannot be done in a desert. So it means you need institutions, you need equipment, but very importantly, you need to convince the very best of a generation to choose science as a possible career for them or a possible path for some time. And I think from that point of view, I think China has already gone quite a long way. I've been exposed also to some Chinese students coming to study at École Polytechnique, and I was the mentor of a few of them. And really, what I was amazed with their dedication, but also the fact that they considered that there was a perspective for them to develop. So certainly, one key element for the future development of China is that this continues. That is, the younger generation sees a perspective to develop. And maybe not necessarily staying all their life in the academic life. They can also bifurcate to other activities. But I think if a country is missing this, that is to give really the visibility of the possibility of developing as a scientist, it's critical. And then, of course, you need equipment. But I think from that point of view, China has also already gone quite a long way and is very ambitious and collaborating with many other countries. And maybe my final word, because I don't want to go over my 3 minutes, is the fact that it's extremely important that the system should be an open system, which means people can interact with people outside of the country, can also have visitors from other countries. Science is definitely a completely international enterprise. And I think even if it's very normal that countries try to have their own style, their own ways of doing things, but in the end, what is really the most powerful thing for science is this kind of a wonderful interaction which has happened in the past, which continues to happen and needs to continue to happen in the future.
Great. Your last point is that science needs openness. I take it that you implied that China is not quite open at this stage yet, and we should talk about, this belongs to the culture issue, and which we'll talk about in the next few minutes. But I want to take your second point, which is young, or the first point, which is the young scientist. I guess you meant young scientists. There are a lot more young scientists get involved in science and learning and
well,
training.
For me, it's obvious that you should not do science as a profession if you don't love it. I mean, you need some kind of passion, some kind of a personal engagement. But then if you want to transform this personal engagement into something which has some kind of a professional dimension, then you need to see some possibility of actually transforming yourself from somebody who is passionate into somebody who can actually realize something. Mm-hmm. And then you have to have some kind of institutional environment. And I think I've seen this happening in some of the Chinese students I had the privilege of guiding in their first steps.
Yeah. Okay. So you're seeing from the perspective. I mean, a lot of young students, but perhaps we could also look at the perspective of young scientists. So maybe, Li-Ming, you could talk a bit about, from your perspective, what it takes to be a leader in science, I mean, in a global sense.
I would say I wouldn't really say on behalf of all young scientists, just based on my personal experience. So I would say I myself have a really mixed feeling about China as the next leader in science globally. On the positive side, I would say, looking at many things, including my own experience, I see a rapid growth in science and technology in China. For example, I graduated from college like more than 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And then I was really interested in pursuing a career in science. But I found my only option was to, say, got my PhD abroad. Because I can hardly find good labs doing cutting-edge science in China. So a lot of my colleagues, my peers did the same thing. We went abroad to got our PhDs from US, from UK, from Japan. Then 10 years later, now, what we can see is we can see a lot of labs. A good number of labs, institutions are pursuing good science here with good support from the government, with a good team of scientists supporting their research. And at the same time, if you look for a lot of metrics, for example, number of papers, number of good papers, total citations of the papers, or to say number of good papers published in top-tier journals, we do see there's a boost of these numbers in the past 10 years in China. So in that sense, I'm really positive about China being the next leader in science in the near future. That's some of my personal experience and perspective.
So 12 years ago, you went abroad for education to learn science.
Yeah.
Do you think now it's time for people around the world to come to China to be educated or to learn about science?
That's a good question. Actually, I wrote a series of articles about PhD choices for undergrads last year. So now I think I'm a biologist, by the way, so I'm only talking about biology. So I think now I'm confident to say that for undergrad student who is interested in pursuing a career in science in China, it's certainly, I wouldn't say going abroad or staying in China is absolutely the right question. So that means he or she has a choice. As long as there's good labs working on the same direction as he or she is interested in, he can choose to stay in China or going abroad. So I wouldn't say at this moment that staying in China, pursuing a PhD degree is already more advantageous than going abroad. I wouldn't say that will happen quickly in the next few years, but hopefully that will be the direction.
What about the non-Chinese who are coming to China? May, you want to say?
Well, actually, I would like to make a slightly different point, keying off of some of the things that the other panelists have said. I should say at the outset that I'm honored to be on this panel. I know all three of these scientists, but I also have to say in full disclosure that I'm not actually a scientist. I'm a lawyer by training, and that may frame what I'm about to say. And that is, the topic, of course, today is whether science will be the next leader in science. And I think actually, given where we are now historically, that another way to think about it is whether there will simply only be a leader or whether there will be many leaders in science, given the fact that knowledge and people can transport themselves and move much more easily than they used to, regardless of how open or closed you may think any country may be at any moment in time. And for me, the more relevant question is actually when China will mature truly into its role as one of the leaders. Mm-hmm. It's clearly on that path. I should say also, usually whatever Jean-Pierre says, I just say whatever he said, because he's usually much wiser on this. But I think that unquestionably in the last 10 to 20 to 30 years, China's progression on the hardware side of the issue, whether it's investment in equipment and labs, investment in training its own undergraduate students and sending them abroad, whether it's to École Polytechnique or Caltech or Stanford or MIT or Oxford, is unprecedented. You know, the percentage that they invest in education now of their GDP is 7%. China's making the largest investment in scientific R&D in the history of mankind. So I think they've put in place many of the appropriate pieces, but there is an ecosystem and a culture that comes along with becoming and maturing as a leader in whatever area that you wish to choose. Today we're talking about science, but it could be any number of things. And I think China's on that path. So I don't think of it as the leader, but I do think of it as one of the leaders.
Yifang, I guess the other panelists they have already mentioned about a few times about the equipment. I guess you're very much into mega science project, and then you think mega science or large facility represent one aspect of scientific leadership. Maybe you want to comment on this and how that would impact.
So to look back this, we first have to understand what does it mean a leader of science. Of course, you have to invest more than probably most of the others, but having the investment is not sufficient. And you really have to examine what are the key ingredients to be a leader. I believe that first, you really need the best equipment. And this equipment cannot be just bought from somewhere, and you have to be able to design and make it by yourself. And so this way, you are able to be the leader in equipment forever, not just, say, at one time you buy from, say, United States, and then you be a leader for, I don't know, to the best for a month, and then afterwards somebody else will take over you quickly. So you really have to be able to have this kind of homemade best equipment and the capability to do it, and also you are able to build a science center in your country. Second, you have to have a lot of very important scientific results and also a few revolutionaries. And if you don't have both, you cannot claim you are the leader of the science. Third, you have to have a group of scientific leaders in your field, in not only one, but in many fields. And also you have to have few which are able to set the tone of this field. So these are, I think, the three key ingredients. Of course, you need many others, like many people have said, you have to have a good funding system. You need to have, for example, innovation, a system with environment which are really supporting innovation, and many, and the education system, so on. But I think to claim to be a leader, you need these three key ingredients. And if you carefully examine these three key ingredients, you probably have to realize that we need large science facilities. Of course, we need many scientific groups which are doing studies in universities and so on. We need them. But large science facilities is a must. Is something which should set your country to be able to claim you are the leader. And the large science facilities can bring you homemade, the world best equipment, the World Science Center, which can attract scientists from all the world to come to your place to study or to do the research. And the large science facilities can also stimulate the technology development and can push your country to be technologically better and better, which in return also give you capabilities to do the best science. And so in this way, I think, and also, of course, large science facilities can train a lot of people which are can be put in a competition with the whole world. So I believe this is not completely sufficient. We don't claim that you do only the large science facilities, but this is a must. You need that.
I see, Jean-Pierre, you want to add to this? And in terms of your own experience as a scientist and your experience in France and being a leader in a European Research Council, we don't necessarily have to have the debate of importance of small science versus large science, but I guess scientists seems to be one of the keys that Professor Wang mentioned, that is not just the scientists working in the field of science, but thought leaders, the scientists who can influence the entire field.
Yeah, I think this is certainly a well-taken point, namely that, well, science transforms itself permanently, and some people really have an impact which really makes a big difference. I had the privilege of being a director of Institut des Hautes Études Scientifiques in France for quite some years. And it's true that I could witness in my field, which was mathematics, but also theoretical physics, how some people really completely transform a field. And that is, after them, you do things completely differently. And this happens in many different disciplines. And of course, how do you get these people? Well, I mean, there are very few of them, and you have to just create the condition for them to thrive, which means most of the time, just give them total freedom. That is really giving them opportunity of gathering around them a group of people and develop their activities in the most in the way which is as free as possible. Of course, this has to be accompanied also by the fact that the discipline is also willing to undergo such a transformation. And this doesn't always happen so easily, because sometimes people come up with a different point of view. And I quite often quote this statement, which was very interesting, I think, by 4 very distinguished German physicists when they hired in the Academy of Science Albert Einstein in 1913. And they make the comment that, of course, he's a great person that they want to attract to Berlin. But even he made some statement in his, these famous 3 papers in 1905. One of them was really the new explanation of the photoelectric phenomenon by claiming that the photons are really particles. And so the comment by these great physicists, including Max Planck, was to say, well, of course, he made some crazy statements, but we should accept that. And actually, it's only by making crazy statements that science is moving forward. And of course, after that, this was one of the major discoveries by Albert Einstein. So we have always to be in this setting that when people come up with really disruptive new visions, sometimes even the greatest people of the time may consider this as really not acceptable. But later, of course, it imposes itself as the right way of looking at things. So there is always this need for the community to accept these kind of ruptures. And they are always, they leave some people aside, and some people can resist. But, I mean, the history of science is full of such situations.
So you're saying disruptive and transformative ideas brought by great scientists who will change the world, and therefore this will become important elements of being a scientific leaders in science.
Yes, that is to create the condition where such people can really actually develop themselves and be accepted, even if there is some resistance by some other parts of the community, and make it possible for them to thrive, which is actually not obvious.
Yeah, so Li Ming, you're in China for quite a few years, and then I guess we're all getting to small science or big science. If you are a leader, you have to have followers, and you have to be a magnet that attracts people, right? So, are we there yet?
I want to follow up on Jean-Pierre's comments. I would say to really become a leader in science, there are certain things that can be planned. For example, we have been talking about investments, talking about recruiting people, talking about big facilities. I think all these are very important, and they can be planned. But as Jean-Pierre just mentioned, I think there are certain components in science advancement that cannot be planned. For example, I can just make an example. For example, when we are talking about the UK as a science leader in history, we are usually not thinking about the money, how many people they have, how many papers they have. We are thinking about Newton, we are thinking about Maxwell, we are thinking about Charles Darwin. For the same thing for the US, we are thinking about Benjamin Franklin, we are thinking about Richard Feynman, people like that. So these great scientists, these important discoveries, they cannot be planned. They just emerge on themselves. So we can foster them, but we cannot plan them. So to me, I think one of the important things we have to keep in mind is that we have to create a culture and a society that foster the emergence of great mind, great discoveries and scientists, instead of simply trying to plan them. And that's why actually in my personal experience, I spend a lot of time actually writing, doing science communications and educations to the next generation. One of the reasons is that
for those of you who don't know, he published 2 books. One is called
the biology of foodies. Something like that.
Biology of the foodies, and then the other one is the God's scissor for
for gene editing. So basically, I think we should really because as Jean-Pierre just mentioned, China doesn't really have a long history and tradition of doing and respecting and fostering science. So now to really foster the great minds and great scientists to emerge, we should spend a lot of time and effort cultivating the science culture in China.
Great. We naturally get into the subject of culture now. So in order for great science and great scientists to emerge in a country, you need certain elements in culture. And I guess May cannot wait to jump in and say what it takes, what kind of culture elements that are needed for creativity, innovation, and...
So actually, I was going to make a different point, but I do think that when we talk about science, and we talk about whether it's big science or small science, we risk missing the bigger discussion, which is the cultivation of great minds. And I think that when I think about Oxford or I think about great academic work or the creation of new knowledge, I think about it in the context of institutions. And by and large, I think about it in the context of university institutions of higher education. And that does, in fact, have a culture that respects not only simply the application of information, but really the genuine pursuit of information or of knowledge and the creation of new knowledge simply for the pursuit, not necessarily for any greater goal. And I think it is in that type of intellectual environment that great science is done. And it's not usually done in isolation. So great science is done alongside of great literature and great writing and great music, great art. I think those things are all done together. And if you look back in history and you look at any number of well-known scientists, starting with Einstein, he'll often say that music was the source of much of his inspiration for his science. Leonardo da Vinci obviously was one of the world's history's greatest scientists, but was also an artist. And so I think there are many different connections, but the pursuit and the creation of knowledge and information for its own sake, I think, is an extremely critical piece of this whole discussion. And it's one often that we forget to have here in China. It's one that we are unfortunately having quite a lot of in the United States, not necessarily to higher education's greatest benefit. And I understand why, given the high price. But I think in China, it's a different set of discussions that can be had.
Yeah, so I want to take on to that subject on culture. So, I mean, the very recent history let's say take United States. United States is unquestionable the leader, today's leaders in science. But United States is not just the leader in science, but leaders of many aspects of culture as well. So you think about it, you think about America, you don't think just about MITs and Stanfords, and you don't just think about how many Nobel laureates and how many great discoveries and how many great talents has been trained, but also you look at United States, they have Hollywood, they have jazz, they have Silicon Valleys, they have all sorts. This whole thing creates a culture environment. We call it ecosystem, which is great for creative minds. So maybe Professor Wang, you could say a few words about what are the, I guess in China, the Chinese tradition has this obedience, and that may or may not necessarily be good for creative thinkings and so forth. So I guess you've trained a lot of students, and you must have experience in how you think we should deal with this.
This is a very difficult question. I think you can get hundreds of answers to this. I can contribute only one ingredient to this. That is that I think a lot of Chinese people, they have their kind of tradition that they always ask the question, what is useful? So this is actually a problem actually you can find everywhere. We are not having, say, a great environment for art. We don't have a great environment for science. And even if you look at, say, the kids in the education system, you put all your energies try to put these kids into a great university, not really asking how to train these kids in the future to be a great man or great scientist or whatever. You look at very narrow-minded and try to put him into a university, have a high score. So all the school system try to put these kids to have a high score because you see immediate effect. We are not really looking to the far future. I think this is actually one of the problems. And this kind of mindset indeed have a huge influence also to our science, not only to our students, to our scientists, but also to our funding agencies. You're always being asked what is useful everywhere. So I think this is really a very bad kind of a culture, I don't know how to call it. And so this also, in our, say, scientific research, we always had this trouble. Whatever we try to get funding, we will be asked this. And you all know that we are now proposing a large accelerator in China, and we were asked many, many times what is useful, and we were asked what is the useful of the high engine physics. If you really look back in the last 300, 500 years, the development of science actually very much follow the study of the structure of the matter. We started from knowing nothing, and then we know we have molecules, we know we have atoms and nucleus, quarks, and so on. And these trends give us, in the end, the physics, chemistry, and a lot of condensed matter science, and many, many things. So indeed, a pure, not useful research is actually, in the end, will give you a really lot. So I think from a cultural point of view, we really have to give up these kind of questions and always asking what is useful. We should not ask this question.
So pursue science for the sake of science, for curiosity and for understanding nature and understanding ourselves, right? And so in that sense, I guess France has a long tradition, a long history of curiosity-driven science. And Jean-Pierre, you may want to say what are the culture elements that are still important for a nation to be a leader?
Well, Thank you for quoting France for that. I think we could quote also some other countries. Definitely, in some way, I think you're correct. I mean, the creation of the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique was very much in this spirit. I personally enjoyed the hospitality of this institution for 44 years. So certainly I felt a lot of freedom. I was hired actually very young. It was a great privilege at that time. Unfortunately, the present generations are not as fortunate as I was. But it's true that I was really left with, I could look at very hard problems because I had no pressure. I had already a position and I could really consider difficult problems. But one thing I would like to bring up, which is the fact that I'm certainly very conscious of what you said concerning the pressure to justify science by its immediate usefulness. So I would like to bring two ideas. The first one is very important, and it's always very difficult. In my position, of course, I have to interact with people at political level. And of course, the key point is that what is the time frame in which politicians in the Western world are functioning? And they are functioning with the next election, which is coming very, very soon after. And therefore, to obtain that people will agree on looking at taking a long view, which is something that in China people take more often, is very hard. So there is this difference in time frame. But the second thing which I want to complement, which at the same time, even if you leave total freedom for researchers to develop their research, which is exactly what we do at the European Research Council. We're just looking for people to submit their most ambitious ideas, and we don't ask them to any relevance for society. I think it proves that if we look now at the number of projects that have been proposed by researchers for the pure sake of research, in the end, they come up with patents. In the end, by their own initiative. And in the end, they are contributing to new companies or new things. So I think it's incorrect to say that curiosity-driven research leads only to ivory towers. Maybe some people will stay in the ivory towers, but at the same time, some others will be coming also with real breakthroughs which will have an impact. So I think to oppose the two is not the right approach. And this is why at the ERC, European Research Council, we really look for what we call frontier research, where we don't want to discriminate between basic research, applied research, or technological research. It's true that a majority of our projects we are financing are on the basic side, but there are still some others which are on even the technological side. And even I remember visiting somebody in Sweden who got a grant from ERC. He said, I'm very surprised I got a grant. I'm not a researcher, I'm an engineer. I'm producing machines. But he said, fine, if your machines, really allow the researchers to make great progress, you're completely welcome. And so it was kind of interesting to see that this person felt himself outside the perspective when he was fully in the perspective.
What about the way of doing science? Isn't it, I'm trying to get it, is that there's certain elements in the way of doing science. That is, for example, being critical. Don't take it whatever other people say. And with these elements, and you mentioned the words openness, right? Openness is another thing. So there are other elements, cultural elements that need to be there in order for science to be really flourishing.
Well, as you know, as scientists, we know that authority is never the right way of being convinced. So you have to convince yourself, which means that you have to come up with rational arguments for this. I'm a mathematician, so of course my profession is just to come up with proofs all the time. And quite often we know we come up with wrong proofs and you have to correct your proofs. But I think, of course, this is a very basic constituent of science. That is, it is there to be challenged. It is there to be developed on a rational basis. And of course, without that, there cannot be any science. So.
Yeah, I'm saying this because in China, this has been a problem. That is, authorities or famous scientists like Professor Wang hardly get any challenge especially from the young students and scientists.
You're absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong.
May you want to add?
So I think it's not. You tried to connect it to openness, and maybe that's a part of it. But I think as China tries to find its own way and its own system rooted in the Chinese tradition and culture, I think Professor Wang said something about the educational process, and I do think it's possible to teach our students to think critically in a way that is without politics, so without.
I understand
without
that
wandering into
you're
some
teaching
place.
a class of critical thinking in the ShanghaiTech.
Yeah, so we do teach a class on critical thinking, and we bring social science methodology in, and I think that the truth is our Chinese students are numerate, which means they're extraordinary mathematicians, and they're quite good at logic in the context of science and doing experiments. But the difficulty comes when they're asked to translate those same skills into a place where numbers are no longer in place and you use words and arguments instead. And I think then their ability to think critically falls a little bit short, not because they cannot do it, but because they've never had the opportunity to learn it. And so if I think about teaching students to find hidden assumptions, or to teach them to identify their own assumptions, or to make clear definitions in the context of something as simple as how would you measure crime, it's a different kind of critical thinking that requires to think about, well, what is the definition of crime? Why are you measuring crime? And then they start to ask different questions. That's actually the essence of good science. It's the essence of good math. It's the same fundamental set of skills, which is that you want to be able to identify assumptions, create inferences, verify or invalidate those inferences. And to do that well in science, you need to be able to do it well elsewhere and practice between those two things. And I think that's part of educational reform. I think that China is well aware that they need to do that. And I think there are many different kinds of efforts. It can be done in the labs of both of these professors. It can be done in a science class. I happen to do it in a critical thinking class. But I think that we've seen tremendous results from that, from students who are able to ask questions in order to find a core issue. I mean, I think often, if we're going to use the word broadly, great science, much great science is done because somebody pursued a particular topic and found an issue or found a way to think about an issue from a different perspective and then created yet a new solution. If you come up with an answer to an irrelevant question, nobody really cares. That's not great science. It's when you come up with a solution to something that people hadn't previously identified. I think that's what Jean-Pierre calls frontier science or frontier research. And it doesn't matter if you're an engineer or if it's small or big or if you're a mathematician or an economist, that's always going to be valuable.
Yeah. Li Ming, you've been educating our young generation yourself. What is your take on?
So I would like to add something slightly different. So we have been talking about the education system, how to train them to be good scientists, especially the next generation. So I have been thinking, so besides training, there's one issue that is at least equally important. That is, once we do have these talented and capable younger generation of scientists, once we identify them, how we like to support them, support their research in China. So as a young scientist myself, I have been seeing a trend that a lot more research projects in China are becoming so-called top design. So basically we have been designing the scheme of the science, even the roadmap from the top. Then in that scenario, the scientists need to team up and basically follow some sort of roadmap to pursue their science. So I would say that for certain projects and certain science, that's certainly important and probably necessary. But I would say it would still be important to leave sufficient room for these capable scientists to pursue some science that they feel interested and passionate freely with little constraint. In other words, after training, after education, after educating these younger generation, we'd like to create a system that allows them to practice their training and to really freely identify their problem, interest, and work on them with sufficient support from the government, from the funding agency, from the institutions.
Yeah. So this really addressed the issue of not just education to students, but creating an environment for younger generation of scientists. There's one element to just basically you're saying that leave them alone. Don't give them too many constraints so that basically speaks to what Professor Wang said, that just increasing funding is not enough, right? And there are other elements that I want to raise an issue of diversity. That is, when you have a diverse environment, you're more likely to stimulate the creativity. Now, even in places like my university, Tsinghua University, if you walk on the campus, there are hardly any black students or white students. Or on our faculty, we have 2 Caucasian professors in the entire med school. So that, I guess, limits its diversity. And I guess what Professor Wang wants to build this large scientific facility, one aim of that is to create an environment that will attract scientists from other places to come to China, isn't it?
In order to have other scientists to come to your place, you have to have a reason. Either you have the best equipment, you have best people would like to work with, or you have something which is very special. So there are a lot of things we are not able to plan, and they have to grow up by themselves alone. But there are a few things which we can plan. So we should just do what we can do. And of course, we have to have some stimulating environment so that we are able to have a genius. But nobody can predict whether we are going to have genius in the next 5 years, 10 years, 100 years. Nobody knows. But let's try to do what we can. There are a few things we can do is to build the world's best science center. And these things, once you are able to have it, you are able to have a World Science Center, and people will come. And then you have the best people in the world work together, and they interact with each other. They may generate a very good, say, environment for innovation. And these kind of things were spread out over the country. And then in the future, afterwards, you may have a good possibility to have a genius come up. And by itself, these science centers can generate, of course, its best equipment. You can have the best results. May not be revolutionary, but you may have a lot of very important good results. They are the best of the field. And you can have the best equipment built by yourself. And it is going to have some momentum, some push to the development of the science in China. So these are things we can do. We just should do it. There are other things we just have to hope there's a luck.
So you're saying that the best equipment and lots of money would attract scientists to come. This actually have already happened in ShanghaiTech, and they have lots of money, and they were able to attract some of the world's best-known American scientists, the member of national academies. They have now quite a lot, actually, like 10 or so world-famous scientists to come. But I guess Li Ming may agree with me. It's not a leader in science, at least not yet. So maybe you could say a few words about what it really takes. Now, you have lots of money, you have the best equipment, you have even the best thinkers on campus, And yet, I think by international standard, ShanghaiTech is not, in today's standard, a center of scientific excellence yet.
Yeah, so I think the key word is yet. In on our defense, we're only 3 years old. So maybe 4 years old. We're going to graduate our first class next year. It's true. So we have Roger Kornberg, Kurt Roethrych. We actually have a Swiss Nobel laureate who spend time there. We have a large number, Ray Stevens in the life sciences area. We have a large number of Western scientists who have chosen to come. We have
Because you have a lot of money.
because we have the facilities. There's no question that, particularly in the United States, as NIH funding and NSF funding continues to get cut, for particularly hard bench scientists who need equipment and big lab space, China is an extremely attractive place to come. I will say that I think from ShanghaiTech's perspective, it is early. It's a little too early to say. I do think that all of the things we've discussed, particularly in terms of environment, will be very important. But if I
Environment in what sense?
in the sense of allowing the young scientists to flourish under mentorship of senior scientists, of not asking the question of what use is it too often or too early. I think the real acid test will be when these Western scientists choose to come here full time. So, of course, Nobel laureates, they're in their own category. They can go where they want, live where they want, do what they want, and most of them do. But we have, to date, I think, very few people who have truly committed to leaving a tenured position at MIT to come here full time, somebody who doesn't look like us. So, somebody who looks like Jean-Pierre, for example, will leave École Polytechnique, or somebody who will leave ETH to come here full time, I think
Why
is
not?
a different kind of test. Well, I think they
Why
have
not?
it.
Why didn't they want to come? If they have paid 5 times the salary, 10 times of their research money, and, beautiful house, brilliant students, why not?
So you can look at KAUST as an excellent example. I think they have tried for many years. Lots of money, great equipment. As somebody said, well, it's still in the desert, so no matter what you do, I'm still surrounded by sand. I mean, I think you
But
need to...
Shanghai's not surrounded by sand.
No, Shanghai's a wonderful city, I have to say. My mother's from there.
Beautiful city.
But it's early. I think it's early, and I think that the uncertainty of the future, the uncertainty of the environment, I think is difficult. It's, as I said, we're on a maturation path, and until the maturation reaches a certain place, people, we're people of rational, we like to think that as scientists, we're creatures of rational decision making. So if you're choosing between MIT and Zhejiang Daxue, which is a fabulous university, for the moment, you may not, for either cultural reasons or scientific reasons, choose to move here full time yet. But I hold out hope that one day that will happen.
So in 3 years, we come back to this place, you think
China
ShanghaiTech
has a
will be-
long history. I think 3 years may not be long enough.
Yeah. Oh,
Can I say a few
Yeah.
words about this? I think
Yifang
this,
wants to say,
this kind of center should not say only depend on the money. If you have a lot of money, you buy equipment, you can buy people there. And quickly somebody got the same money, he can do the same. So the center, so-called center will be shifted quickly. So the key is actually that your equipment is not bought from somewhere. It has to be built by yourself. You have the capability to design, build equipment, you do the best. And these kind of capabilities, people will take 10, 20, 30 years to catch up. So there's no way it can be changed and shifted to somewhere else.
you mean very unique equipment
You
that
have
other
to.
places
You
cannot have?
You have to. If you don't have these capabilities, no, you are not the center of the science.
Yeah, that might be true for physics, but it's probably not true for life science. I mean, right?
Or math.
Li Ming, I can hardly imagine that any place would build equipment that is so unique and it's so expensive and so unique that others cannot make or others cannot build, and therefore they cannot.
Even for biology, if you buy all the equipment, and right now, most of the equipment, I believe, from Europe, from the United States, I believe they're not from China. So if you are able to buy them all in China, build the world best center,
All right.
I don't think you can claim China as a center
Okay.
of the science, of the biology.
All right,
Cannot
so
do
I
that.
see 2 points. One is the homemade equipment, very unique, very special, and the other is a full-time job. I'm not satisfied with these two explanations. I'm not. Anyone chime in?
So I'm gonna say something. I think that Professor Wang's point about homemade equipment, I might interpret it a slightly different way. I was also puzzled, but I think the way he's describing it, it's a proxy for frontier cutting-edge science. And if you use it as a big umbrella, I think that does cover a lot of waterfronts. I don't think it's singularly sufficient, nor is having people come here full-time. Again, I think it's simply a signal or a proxy that we've come along the path. I don't think those may be necessary, but they're certainly not sufficient. So I just want to say that as a point of clarification.
Well, I may want to venture into an area. I mean, I'm sure a lot of audience a lot of people sitting in the audience, they are not scientists. So what about the non-science elements that are important for China to be a leader in science?
Well, if you allow me to say something on this, I think some places in history have become really places where things have changed, where they really have been able to attract amazing people. I mean, a very good example of this is Copenhagen with the Copenhagen School in quantum mechanics. And of course, they were extraordinary people, but also clearly the atmosphere of the city was very, very important. If you look more in the social sciences, I mean, Vienna at some point was a fantastic place of actually very multicultural, and where people with different backgrounds really, and also you could see both in terms of the music, in terms of the psychology or psychoanalysis, really totally, I mean, it was a very special place, and people wanted to be there because it was there that you could meet some extraordinary people. So at some point, there is something happening at the place where a spirit of, a special spirit develops, which is a mixture of many different things, which is difficult to identify as a, but it has happened in history in a number of places, and with the various, if you go back to Greece and Athens, it was for some centuries really a very extraordinary place in terms of creating a new way of thinking and bringing together people with very different backgrounds.
Right.
So I think there's this dimension which is difficult to describe analytically, but you can be recognized at some point that at some moment there is really something coming together. You mentioned France at some point, definitely in terms of painting, Paris was a very special place at some point. I don't think it is anymore, and it's difficult to describe why at that time.
So
it
that's
definitely happened.
another element that great scientific leaders could be inspired by people who are not scientists, including musicians and artists and historians and so forth. To me, there's another element that is, I think one of the greatest contribution to science, especially in biomedical science, is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Howard Hughes, and now the recent one is the Paul Allen Institute for Brain Science. Those people who are not a scientist, but they made a huge contribution by doing science in a way the scientific community itself cannot or do not do by itself. I guess Li Ming wants to say a few things about
I guess that problem goes back to communication and education issues. Because, say, I guess you are basically referring to the support of science by the public, by the private foundations, including the private foundations. I think that's certainly an important element of being a science leader and science center. But to really have that, meaning to have these private foundations supporting science, to have these rich people donating
public
to
engagement in
science,
science.
we first need to cultivate a culture that respect, that love, that have their engagement with science. that's something we are still lacking in China. I think that will be the first step, in my opinion. That first of all, we really have to spend a lot of effort and time educating people what is science, why science is beautiful and powerful, and why they should get familiar with science, and why the younger generation need to, at least some of them should find science interesting and should pursue science as a career. Then that will be a time we can really talk about have private support of science, have the general public support of science. That's my opinion.
I'm sorry that we're kind of running out of time, but I want to give a chance to the audience who may have questions for our distinguished panelists.
I come from the paper. My question is about honesty, integrity, honesty and integrity. You have heard about the withdrawal of Chinese papers. I wonder if you have anything to say.
这个学术诚信，我想这本身是一个不需要讨论的一个问题。我觉得作为一个科学家，或者作为一个从事学术
As a scientist, we shouldn't have to discuss the question of integrity. It shouldn't be a question. Maybe it's temporary in China. And there is a utilitarian view towards science. Maybe where there's too much haste in academia in China. We want to spread the ideal of science. We want people, including students who are involved in science, to understand that ideal. I think with continued efforts, this will improve. Yep.
It's a topic I spend a lot of time discussing with my students. I think the term academic integrity that we use in English, when it's translated into Chinese as 学术诚信, loses a little bit of the nuance and the history of academic integrity. I give my students a list of events. I say, somebody copied 10 words from somebody else's dissertation, to they copied 10 pages, to they cited something from Wikipedia, to they forgot to leave a citation. And I'll have a list, similar types things, and I'll say to the students, which of these constitutes, some sort of academic misconduct? And the students inevitably pick the one that says, they copied 10 pages. And I'll ask them, but why are these other things acceptable? And they don't actually have an answer, and I think it's not because they don't want to know or they don't understand, but they've never been taught. Whereas in the West, at a very young age, we are taught to take notes and then to write our own sentences and to create our own arguments. We're actually taught that attribution is extremely important. As a lawyer, I spent one semester learning how to write citations. But I think there's a piece of academic integrity that involves responsibility and conduct. It's a concept, if you look historically, came from the 1700s and eventually evolved to the integrity of the institution, starting with the integrity of the individual and moving to the integrity of the institution. And I think that's not something that the students understand. And I think when they're taught that, it is something that we will slowly begin to ameliorate and hope to see decrease. But I think it is also related to what's happening in Chinese society more broadly. And I think those two things are very hard to separate out.
Right. I thank you for this great question that also adds to yet another element that's perhaps pretty serious or missing that will hurt the development of science in China. But anyway, our time is up, and so I want to and have all the audience have a round of applause for our distinguished speakers, and thank you for coming and stay late to the session. Thank you.